Welcome back to Taller Together, the podcast from Armature magazine exploring the systems, structures, and quiet custodians that uphold the art world. I'm your host, Tamzin Lovell, and today we're looking at trust in built form, how architecture shapes our sense of safety, belonging, memory, and meaning inside cultural spaces. Our guest is the remarkable architect Gilbert Balinda, founder of Gilbert Balinda Architects, currently based between South Africa and France, with work across Europe and Africa. Gilbert's practice sits at the intersection of architectural design, cultural narrative, and civic responsibility, with a strong emphasis on how buildings embody trust, identity, and public good. As we developed issue number 2 of Armature magazine, it became clear that trust is not only a human network or a digital safeguard, it is also spatial. Museums must feel safe to enter, safe to gather in, safe to remember in, and architecture becomes a silent guardian. And this is where Gilbert's voice is extraordinary. Today, we're exploring how architecture builds or breaks trust in cultural institutions and what the next era of museum design will require. Gilbert, thank you for connecting with me today from the south of France. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Hello, Tamzin. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to participate in your podcast and very, very interested to carry on this conversation. It sounds very exciting what you're already doing with your team, and I'm very, very happy to be here.
Thank you for taking part in our little experiment. Gilbert, one of the threads running through your work is the idea that architecture is not just functional, it is relational. It shapes how people feel and trust an institution. When you look at museums and cultural buildings today, what do you see as the biggest shift in how communities expect these spaces to behave?
I think there is a big disconnect between, obviously, how we engage on the work in the museum world and sometimes how the public and the communities that we're supposed to serve engage with it. We know for sure that the museum space is redefining itself. We're talking much more about inclusivity. We're talking about the redefinition of the word museum itself has been amended since 2022 by ICOM, which is guiding the museum word. So we're looking at museum in a new lens. I think our work as architects at the moment is not only to do an assessment of the previous work, but assess the fast-paced changing world in which we noticing and participating in it. And obviously museums, one of the reflection of our society, at least an angle of it. There is a relationship that needs to be reconsidered carefully to ensure that the art space and the museum space actually does the work it was intended to do.
And I think that dialogue has increased. That's my sense of it, having been at conferences and things. And we've also seen a wave of new museum openings and announcements of imminent openings across Africa and Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And many of them are redefining the role of architecture in cultural life. What do you think is driving this global museum boom, and what does it reveal about cultural priorities today?
It's very surprising. We've discussed this with some colleagues as well about the number of museums that are opening. And frankly, it's a bit surprising because, not so long ago during the pandemic, I think that's where really the conversation about the viability of museums were really expressed. I remember the period which coincides with the renaming that I've just mentioned earlier. The institutions started really looking at it, and the conversation happened about transforming those spaces. There's a discussion about restitutions that started getting momentum, in which we both participated as well.
Yes.
But I think the question that must be asked is, are we redefining the museums with this new definition because a movement has already started and we're creating more and more considered museums, or the definition precedes in a way? And regardless of the answer, I think what's important to note there is that systemic change is slow. It's something that will take time. So I am unsure that the new museums and this resurgence of museums are really guided by a renewal of what this work should do, what if it's really guided by this social aspect to it, or if it is just another continued expansion of how the museum can serve as a reaffirmation of power and prestige of certain institutions. There's a good analysis to look at it. I wouldn't be able to answer and tell you that this is great, because I think there's a lot of conversation happening. It seems to have moved quite fast between a moment where we question the institution itself and the pop-up of all these museums across the world. And especially in Africa, I mean, we need to question that.
Absolutely. And you're right. And the thing that doesn't move fast is building a new museum, designing it, building it, and getting it open. So these things have been projects in the running since before COVID, long in the running. It may have been conceived in a different environment of identity or civic pride, whatever was driving it then. And they might have to adapt a little bit or accommodate a changing kind of psyche around it. You often speak about architecture as a form of storytelling. How would you approach the challenge of designing cultural buildings that carry the weight of history while remaining open and contemporary?
I'm not sure that those two aspects are mutually exclusive. I'm going to be self-critical about it quite often, not because the work is in any sense based in critical or anything like that. I think there is great work being done, but at the same time, I think there is a reshape that is really necessary. I think we need to separate again from an architecture point of view and then the institution part as well. I think the two elements are always together. There has been so far a big conversation that was almost from a top-down decision structure. So when we would approach projects, our projects will be decided almost in a vacuum, pretty detached from the reality on the ground. And then we insert a number of professionals during the making of that museum with obviously sometimes stakeholder engagement. But I do think that the question is so less around how the process was done and how the outcome were really engaged with the communities. The tools that we were using or we still using sometimes needs to be really rethought. The way that we conceive those spaces and how we look at how the communities would engage in those spaces is pretty regulated. There is a framework to follow. So in one sense, we talk about openness, and on the other side, we talk about an institution or a building, by definition, is very complex. The right balance really is to make those places open, as you say, while at the same time being, a storage of memory, a storage of artifacts, and storage of valuable things. So there is a duality there that is quite interesting, and what makes the museum space very, very, very fascinating. But I also think that it's not really a compromise. I think that we should be having more conversation about how we engage our relationship to what is contained into the museum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to start the conversation from. When we're engaging in a museum, well, what is the first reason in our context? Although I'm here in France, I mean, most of my practice has been in African context, really, and mainly South Africa. But the first things what we should be answering is, why should we go to the museum, and what are we searching in a museum beyond the educational part and role that museum plays? Is, as a society, why do we need those structures and how important are they? And I think that conversation is really crucial. And then we can go into, this relationship we have created, this ritual we have created towards the artifacts and the way we engage with it.
Absolutely. It is fascinating. More and more of those conversations are starting to happen, which is wonderful, because this issue is about trust. Do you think architecture can create trust? And if so, what are the spatial or sensory cues that make people feel safe and welcomed or included in a cultural space?
I like really the framing of it, because to be honest, not a lot of question around when we have a discussion about those spaces. I don't think it's perhaps the first time that we have the angle of trust and safety, which is really interesting, because in some way it gives me a lens on how you perceive the museum world and how people perceive it. And it makes me realize that the experience that visitors have of museums after that research and that conversation doesn't really happen often. So, but to respond precisely to your question, I don't think I ever start a design process with consciously thinking about trust. I think it's already deeply inherent to the profession, and it's really embedded in the work we do. It becomes almost like a natural consequence. It becomes more interesting when afterwards, when we look at it and how we're discussing it. When we're talking about trust, obviously we're looking more about the experiential and the emotional dimension of it, more than the safety. That's part of the inherent, obligations of the architect. When we're talking about that experience that we want to create, I think a lot of it is also contextual. And I was having a discussion about it because it goes to, could you trust an environment where you feel held, you feel like the space is holding, you feel welcome? It's attacking the problem from a different angle, but the end result is that historically, museums have always played almost an architectural gesture that suggested more power. We use monumentality, heavy doors, vast volumes. And although those are also anchored in technical reason, it does diminish the human experience. It can come across as very intimidating, and therefore the trust into appreciating the experience is often diminished. From one context to another, you could imagine that for a certain part of population, that relationship is quite important if you want the message to go across. When we're going into a bank, and if you have to go through all these, double doors with one door opening, one door closing behind you, you somehow prepared to a certain experience on the other side.
Or you're going to a cathedral or something. You're in awe because that's what you expect to experience in a space like that.
Exactly. You can see the movement of the architecture and museums trying to shift towards more engaging spatial relationship, just to create that psychological preparation and really welcoming about a good experience rather than like safeguarding. You have to differentiate between a building that safeguards and a building that creates connections and puts community together. And that goes back to the definition that we were just talking about right now. Is that, are we creating building to foster relationships and connections? And in the same way, do the exact role that we should be doing is conservation, etc., on this artwork? Or are we just really oriented about pure conservation of artifacts and showing artifacts?
Absolutely. When you think about technology, it's running deep now in cultural buildings, from security to climate systems and digital archives and visitor experience. How has technology changed the way architects think about museum design, especially around risk and safety, and then digital integration or people's experience within that space?
Ooh, that's a good question. I will be careful not to mention the disaster that just happened at the Louvre. What is really fascinating is and we discuss it a lot with our colleagues, is the disconnect, again, between the perfect image, the perfect functionalities of what we plan, and especially more in Europe than in Africa. But we are told to plan for really international standards, a level of execution of architecture and work that is competing on a world standard. Some of the execution down the line between the big idea and the museum itself, there is a lot of improvement happening. And I think the technology is helping to bridge the gap. It should be deployed much more. A lot of this technology that we're talking are nice add-ons to the architecture. They don't really entirely drive the architecture. And what we've tried so far for the last couple of years at GBA is to really harness some of those technological innovation to simulate and use a lot of digital twins specifically for museums, which we're developing right now, to understand how those qualities could be enhanced and blind spots can be resolved. We have amazing technology going forward. It's not specific to just museums, it's specific to the profession itself. AI has obviously moved the way we conceive quite quickly, but there is still a lot to do. It's almost to say that there's a lot that should be fixed in the foundational work. Technology is not really going to replace all of that. The inclusion of that is necessary. It helps us look at different angles and create correlations between, for instance, how people would move into a building and what would be the impact, let's say, the HVAC and the consumption of energy on a museum. And there are correlations. I think that's where technology is really great. It's about seeing those blind spots wherever we were not looking before because we didn't have the ability to do that. You can go very deep into the future of the building and how it should behave. I think we in a space that is really exciting for architecturally, and that's everywhere. Really amazed about the speed at which it's going as well.
So it's a big part of what we do is working with architects. We've done it for years, and that's, of course, where you and I met. It's always been exciting as a technology company to be brought in at the stage of design when the architects are busy doing their thinking, and you can have these debates and experiments and tests, and it really helps the end result. You and I have had lots of discussions about the exciting things you're doing around digital twins. It is an exciting territory. By the time we've done our bit, those things are invisible to many of the visitors. What the visitors are looking at when they come in are more around the collections and things. I also see the museums bringing in more, taking on more immersive installations, dealing with bringing live data into their displays, like digital collections. So those changes are also happening that are very visible to the audience. For you, what does future-proof museum look like from an architectural perspective, taking all those back of house, front of house things into consideration?
There's a danger to move to gimmicks. There's a beautiful thing about when we speak about innovation and we speak about the future. Architecture has already resolved that. I know very little things that have stood the test of time, that can hold memory between walls and strong stories, and yet you can still project yourself in the future. Sometimes those buildings have housed many, many different functions, so they have been mutating in terms of use. It depends how you take the problem. I see architecture itself as good architecture, good executed architecture is constantly adaptable, moving, and at least the essence of it.
Are you talking about flexible spaces?
Well-designed spaces. There is a Centre Pompidou in Brussels, which is opening. To make the story short, the idea of the museum in Brussels has been in the making for many, many years. And there was a political decisions around the collection and the size of the collection. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that some of the collection that was held by the Belgian government could not be completely displayed there. So the Pompidou put forward a proposal to use some of their collections. So suddenly things snowballed into, it became the Pompidou Brussels. And there is a debate about why are we doing a French structure in Brussels? Don't we have, our own cultural identity there? And it's done into a building that used to be the center of Citroën, the car dealer. And it's a big Art Deco building with, a lot of lighting and so on. And for years, it's been costing millions and millions because there is this emphasis of turning that space that could have been used very differently, I think, there was no real gain of putting the museum there. I think there was more about this museum should represent. It forced the architect to really challenge themselves into creating museums that are highly environmental controlled element into basically a glass box that was existing, and then digging deeper, and we're, next to the water level. We were trying to force something that was not into the right space, and we should have thought about different space across the road. There was other industrial buildings that were probably better suited for that. We should look at, how we reuse buildings and where is the right place to build a museum or not. And I think that conversation is sometimes not happening. And we can see it with this really gigantic structure that we build everywhere. That can happen in other portion of the world. But if we bring again the conversation on an African perspective, I think it has proven to us that on the long term, it's just not sustainable. Going back to the technological part of it, we should be careful about what is real, what makes the essence of a museum, what are the grounding elements, the non-negotiable bases that we need to put down first before we engage into that act of construction, because as I said, it's a very long one.
Yeah.
And by the time you actually finish the museum, I think there is chances that you're already obsolete, especially if you're gearing everything towards technology. Where is the time? Where is the innovation here? Between something that's structured that have proven to stand past the test of time, and then you really, focus it on highly technologically driven. How much updates do we need to do? And I think that goes up a lot about the exhibition spirit now, that's or philosophy, where it's really heavily driven by tech, with all these immersive experiences and so on. And I think there's a real danger that the organization that were already stretched in terms of keeping the finances of museums, which is a very difficult exercise to do, now need to look at the rapidly changing and thirsty public for technological innovation. And I think that is another point that we need to be careful about.
Very good point. Some of the basics, just climate control in the context of the climate risk environment that we are dealing with, is something that consumes enormous amounts of cash for museums. And of course, something we deal with because we're as Artfundi, which is the backbone of the collection data, cybersecurity is a huge future-proofing essential component for the future museums. If they lost their data, they'd be in real trouble. So having a centralized system that can manage the data and the archive and all the provenance and be nimble enough to let people curate in the way that they want to, in a kind of modern way, and showcase as well, but then also know it is cyber secure is super important. And of course, resilience is no longer optional.
Yeah.
So what emerging risks do you see as most urgent for cultural buildings that you can address through design?
I think the collection portion is an important one. I mean, we've had these conversations as well together, and we know many cases where that angle there is no transparency around that, right?
Yeah.
About certain structures and institutions where a valuable collection not held. When you put again into perspective, and I say trying to rewind and beat every time, the entire idea of having a huge collection and housing a collection, because that's really the premises of why we do museums, right? I mean, there's something very strange about it that we should perhaps think about. And we can touch about it because later on, but the idea that you would accumulate knowledge in a physical form and call it artifacts, which you know very little about, and then you conglomerate all of that and you decide that for the future generation, you're gonna conserve that. And so you invent, in your opinion, based on your climates, that's, cold is the best, conservation elements. You're freezing decay. And that costs money, that costs energy, that costs all the thing. And that's part of a huge building. And then you ask people to come and look at them, and they are controlled in glass box. If you had to zoom really out and look at it it's a very strange ritual. But it is a ritual. And if you really go back, you would quickly realize that ritual already existed for the object in its natural environment. And perhaps what we should have been doing is to move ourselves into those spaces where that ritual and that object was never displaced, build a shelter for it if we wanted, and engage and have a really deep and meaningful conversation about it, rather than have engineered something to recreate another form of ritual. Yeah, I digress a bit, but I think that's where we are in creating these things and these collections and all of it. And 97% of it will be stored somewhere, and there is absolutely no visibility to it. And only 2% will be visible. And again, that's where the technological aspects, for me, I think it's a big saver, and it should be really investigated quite well, because it's about bringing visibility, even if it's the elements are stored, to the public, and giving agency to protect them from a larger public. I think ownership is important. If you give the sense that our artifact, the collective memory, is safely stored and in a sustainable manner where we can think about it, then I think it makes it much easier.
Yeah.
And I think we have the means now to do it.
Yes, we do. And safely stored doesn't mean out of sight. Through the digital, it can still be shared.
Exactly.
These are all decisions And if we think about leadership, museums are shaped by leadership, by funders or boards or governments and communities. Who do you think usually drives the vision for a cultural building, and how does that affect the final outcome?
I'm not too big on institutions. I mean, I'm saying not big on it because I'm not an expert of like institutions works very carefully. I'm not a specialist of that sector. What I can say is from where we engage, where we are introduced into the process is usually later on in my experience. There was an era where museums were a political statement. We had these different phases of where every president would put up a museum. And I think that is still carrying on. We can see it's the reaffirmation of power through museums. That's something, that relationship has always been there. And I think it will carry on being what it is. And the fact that we see all these museums in the Middle East, and there is deeply an association to power. If we think about our own environments and the institution and where we come in, the negotiation is really hardly possible. I think that the systems are already in place, and the job that the museum could do is much bigger than the brief that is obviously driven by that. I'm very unsure why it took us a very long time to be sitting on those tables of where we can engage in a constructive manner on where the project should go. And that led us to do much more feasibility studies with governments and do that preparation in advance with them. It was the only way for us to just sit on the table and, have that conversation with government or lending institutions and so on. And in those spaces, it's possible. But in other spaces, Freedom Park is a good example, for instance, like without going into too much details about it, but, it was a political agenda. And if you look at the naming itself and what it was supposed to stand for, it's not what it has delivered. And there's many aspects and many examples of museums not delivering what we're supposed to do. Even if the ideas were really grand, I think the execution has led us to where we are today. So I'm not sure who makes those decisions, but I know there's a series of steps, and in a way the wheel is already going.
Yes.
And everybody fits in the wheel, and then you end up at the end with this with this project. But these are opportunities. I don't want to sound negative about it. I think it's good to assess where we are. I think that the fact that there is a moment to pause and rethink, it's a very healthy thing. And I think we're living in the right shift. This is the right moment. 10 years ago, I wouldn't be saying that, but I think today we're really in a great place to at least reimagine and reinvent.
So on that positive note, for institutions that are thinking ahead, what advice would you give cultural leaders about designing buildings that will feel meaningful and trusted and relevant for 30 or 50 years or 100 years?
Well, the question is that do you need them to be relevant to 50 years? And the second question is the speed on which the world is evolving. I mean, you and I would have had like a very different conversation maybe like 2 years ago, right? I mean, like looking 2 years, what has happened like geopolitically speaking?
For sure.
Are we very sure that in the next 2 years, what we are deciding right now is right? And I think that's where this idea that I'm trying to put forward is perhaps it's time to think about not creating one single point which is massive and tries to reach a huge amount of people. Maybe it's the time to rethink the model as a network model with smaller, agile responses, targeted responses. And we need to redefine, and I think with this redefinition of museums, there is scope for that. It's no longer objects really emphasize. We're talking a lot about intangible assets, intangible heritages, that we're talking about social connection and so on. And that's why this definition for me is really, really interesting. I would really hope that it's revealing a huge systemic change. But if we had to go into that idea of I mean, you understand that you have a data scientist, I think you're more equipped to explain this than me. But it's more a neuronal like network really. And if you have smaller structures that are easily adaptable, that are responding better to the small context, and their work is pretty much targeted, but they are connected to each other. We need to think about those kind of things. yeah, that's what I think that's an idea worth investigating.
You and I have brainstormed about that idea of the node that has the ability to sort of send things out into communities and back again, rather than always asking the community to come to you. Part of what this redefinition that you're talking about, and that's part of the agility, which I think is very exciting.
Exactly. But we tend too much to try to compartmentalize things, right? We try too much to have one unique definition of things. And, if we speak about identity and so on, we have difficulty to imagine that many realities can coexist and they can be contentious. I don't know why we have this kind of mental structure around it, because nature is not really about one singular solution, right? It's a whole ecosystem. And in a way, we try, I'm not surprised that some of these large structures don't work, because they seem very unnatural to me. I think they all seem very unnatural to a lot of people. So the idea of this layered building that can allow coexistence of different meanings and different narratives, can allow to be used and reappropriated differently, is something we should think about, rather than trying to really project ourselves into a future that we frankly don't know much about. And it seems harder to even do in the world in which we're living. It doesn't seem, the right way.
I love how you spoke about it doesn't seem natural and nature. I love how many of your designs are inspired by nature and by people within the context of a natural environment, and how they might use that kind of space as an extension of other things they do within their own environments. People will be able to read and see some of your designs in the magazine. So I'm excited about that for anyone who's listening. Gilbert,
yes.
I could talk to you for a very long time, but let's end off with some quick fire questions. So I'm going to ask you for a book or film that you recommend.
A book that I would recommend is an old one. I think it's pretty close to me, but it does touch on this idea that we spoke about nature, but we didn't really touch too much about identity. But I think that's an important point. It's a French book. It's called Les Identités Meurtrières. It's from Amin Malouf, the writer. He's from Lebanese origin. He wrote the book in 1998, just after the genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsi, and then there was the Balkan Wars. There was a lot of wars in those 90s years. And obviously, I'm from Rwandan origin, so at that time, the book came at a very important moment in my life, because identity was kind of shifting as a refugee and arriving in Europe and in exile. And he touches about identity is not a frozen thing. It's multiple layers that can coexist as well. And also they change over time. And the only way that you would express is if the environment allows you to express all this multitude of layers. And sometimes, and that's where fascism and so on happens, and authoritarian regime, is that you're forced to only share the least threatening portion of your identity.
We'll put the link below. Sounds like an important book to read.
Link below to the book.
And Gilbert, who gave you great advice that you still use?
I don't have a particular person, and I would say my dad had a pretty rough time. And I think, obviously, his advice, I never listened to them when I was younger. But I think now that I'm growing gray hair, they tend to come back as hunting, they're hunting me a bit, sometimes now that I'm a dad, and, like some of those things just come back, and you're like, okay, I understand what he meant. I haven't been listening very well to people. I've been challenging more than listening, but I'm trying to change that.
And what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
Be patient, and then don't be too hard on yourself.
That's good advice. I'm still struggling with that. And Gilbert, if you were an artwork, which one would you be and why?
I think I love the Giacometti walking man structures. Haven't really, looked deeply into it, but always been really driven to that. I think that the filiform approach and the walking nowhere, I've also seen them in really amazing settings. And I think they were pretty powerful artwork. It felt like it really explained, the journey of life.
That's what you do in your work. You put yourself in amazing settings all the time. Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamzin.
Your work reminds us that trust is not just a social contract. It is something that we walk through, we gather within, and we feel in our senses. and cultural buildings are living infrastructures of care, memory, and possibility. To explore more of Gilbert's work and for deeper insights into the hidden architectures of trust, visit Armature issue number 2, where we featured Gilbert's work in a bit more detail with pictures, so you'll enjoy that. I'm Tamzin Lovell, and this has been Taller Together, produced by Artfundi Media Lab. Thank you for listening.